Thank you very much. Now, let me open the Q&A session with by inviting Charles and Dan to turn on their camera. I welcome them, but also, in order, since I expect many questions, I invite Charles and Dan to stay within 12 minutes for their time, including Adina's response. And I invite the attendees to begin to book their question by using the raise hand button that Fabrizio is now pressing. If you can check, is him, Fabrizio Calzaverini, in the list of attendees. But okay.
Yes.
Can I say one thing before you start?
Of course.
If you have any comments also about the paper itself, that and this goes for anybody, from major to minor things. Since this is not yet submitted, I'd be very grateful for specific comments on the paper, as well as more general questions and things like that. That's all.
Well, that's it. We will maybe provide your email if you wish to the people to substantiate this invitation.
That would be great.
Okay, I see there is a question already among the attendees, but first, Charles, will you join? You got to unmute your microphone.
Charles, you got to unmute there.
Okay, now it's unmuted.
Okay, so you can hear me.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Thanks very much for the talk, Adina. I think it was a nice overview, and you bring up some of the, I think, important philosophical questions related to the big picture idea of whether you can learn about the mind from using MVPA kind of techniques. I guess so I have a few questions, but I'll try to formulate one to get started, and it's about the reason that the proxies are available in the first place. And I think the reason why we think the proxies are available for neuroimagers might influence our understanding of the degree to which you can get functional insight from methods like this. So maybe it's helpful to have a metaphor in mind or an analogy. You could imagine a library being organized by author name alphabetically, or you could imagine it being organized by content. And so if the brain were like a library in which everything is organized by content, and you think of sort of the real neural code as the content of each individual book, then by looking at the section in which the book is found, you might get a bit of useful information about what's actually in the words of the book. And you wouldn't really expect that to happen if the library were instead organized in a more digital way, just by by the author's last name. So to sort of this might not be a very good analogy, but to use it for a second, you might expect that if the brain were organized by content, then these methods would take us quite a long way, and if they were organized in some sort of in the author-like way, that these methods would run out. And my worry, or it's not really a worry, it's more of just a question, is whether the most impressive cases that you've seen so far, like the paper that you cite from 2008 in Neuron, I forgot the first author's name, or last author's name, the Kriegeskorte paper, and somebody else. Mirror, yeah. Yeah. So they're looking at the ventral stream, sort of these higher object selective areas, and the distinction between animate and inanimate, for example. That's one that you're going to see, that you're going to expect to have been evolutionarily super important. You'll see it across all different kinds of animals, presumably. So my worry is, I wonder if that's just an exception. So that's just this one area of the library that happens to be organized in this way that sort of lends itself to recovering information at the voxel spatial scale. Whereas if you, ask about thoughts that might, the vehicles of which might have more to do with the front of the brain, then you're going to lose this nice relationship between the low-level facts of the neural code and the high-level information that's available through brain imaging. So that's the question. Is it possibly just an accident that that you get some coherence between information at spatial scales just in this one area, and elsewhere in the brain it won't work as well?
Yeah. Am I supposed to answer this now, or am I supposed to wait until all your comments are done?
No, you can answer now.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a great question, and I actually really like the analogy. I mean, I think it's a nice way of illustrating the difference. And so I think I don't think it's an accident. I think it's indicative of a very widespread underlying mechanism, which is that things that basically things that fire together, wire together, and various kinds of efficiency considerations like minimizing axonal length and stuff. So you see across the brain lots of evidence that things that have similar function are located nearby. And that has two kinds of, that both goes for and against the efficacy of fMRI, right? Because the fact that things are not homogeneously distributed and that in some sense they are co-located by function gives the ability of something that's so low resolution to give you information about function. On the other hand, the fact that things that are very closely related are going to be probably more closely spatially related is going to put a limit on how much you can infer. Now, I mean, there are some methods for trying to tease out even activity within the same voxel, like adaptation methods. Mm-hmm. So I think that there are various things that you can do to effectively get even better resolution than you might think. But I think that you're asking exactly the right question. There are reasons to think that that the library is going to be organized more according to content than other sorts of things, that, more according to content than sort of randomly. But there are going to be limitations to what you can figure out, and that's going to be also dependent upon where you're looking and other kinds of tools that you bring to bear. And I think we don't actually know well enough what the...
Oh, I just lost. Adina just froze for me for a moment.
She's on lag, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, back.
Adina, we missed the last minute.
Oh, really?
Not a whole minute, just 20 seconds we lost you.
Yeah.
What was the last thing you heard?
You came back around to the library, and you said that you think there are reasons that it's organized by content rather than randomly, and then you said a few other things, but that's where I got. Okay. I was thinking about that, so that's the last thing in my head.
Yeah. So I think it is more organized by content, than it is randomly. But I do think that there are going to be, limitations to the fineness of grain of the content that we're going to be able to discern using these kinds of proxy vehicles.
Yeah.
I did say that there are other methods that can be used to tease apart.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
I think, but basically, the fact that there are these structure function relationships, I think, legitimizes the attempt. And we don't know enough about the structure function relationships to, sort of a priori say, here's what the limitations are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be something that we find. Another thing to think about is, I guess one of the things that gives you some hope are like experiments that Frank Tong, for instance, did looking at orientation, selectivity, and visual cortex.
That 2005 paper.
I don't remember the year, but yeah, I think.
I think I know the one you mean. Yeah.
You know, he was able to, decode orientation from functional MR-sized voxels, which are much bigger than the orientation, the size of the orientation columns. And the reason is that there are functional inhomogeneities across voxels that give you, a slight bias one way or another. And so it's still not clear whether you can leverage that technique in areas of cortex where we know a lot less about what the receptive field properties are, but it's reason to think that you can, that inhomogeneities can give you some kind of leverage in trying to understand the coding.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Maybe I'll pass it on to Dan, and maybe we'll have a second round.
Yeah, so this is I think this is a bit of a related question. So I was trying to kind of work out the parts of the paper that were specific to RSA from the parts that were specific to imaging, and kind of trying to separate out the concerns there. And I think I wanted to focus in line with Charles's question on this idea of what the gold standard would be for having access to neural representational vehicles. The idea that imaging in particular gives you only access to these kinds of proxy vehicles, right? These kind of constructions out of voxels, which are a certain kind of fiction, not the real causally operative processing units in the brain. That seems plausible, and there are some points in the paper where you kind of gesture or suggest what would be something more like what you take to be the ground truth about what the vehicles are and the kinds of methods that would give access to that. So there are a few points where you talk about single unit recording, corroborating RSA, and I think the idea of kind of single unit electrophysiology being the most direct kind of access point, or the gold epistemic standard for what the neural vehicles would actually be, comes up at a few points in there. So and in fact, in the definition of a neural representational space, you say that it's defined more or less by particular, the number of particular neurons. So there seems to be the kind of ground level truth seems to be at the level of single neurons and interconnections of them. And I guess so one question is whether there are any methods that give us kind of gold standard access to this besides imaging. But related to this, I guess, was a kind of question about the Kriegskort 2008 paper, which is really extremely weird, right? So if you think about it from this point of view, it's actually extremely weird. So you might say, all right, well, look, imaging gives us access to these kinds of smeared out blobs, these voxels, which are not the real things. The real vehicles are, activities in single units or something like that, something low level neurophysiological like that. And if we can establish relationships between the low-level neurophysiology and what's going on in RSA, that's a kind of corroboration about the neural vehicles. But from that point of view, the 2008 paper is super weird because on the one hand, it looks like the dissimilarity matrices between monkey IT cortex and human IT cortex as imaged are pretty comparable. On the other hand, this is like 674 neurons, from 2 different monkeys that are being combined into this thing, and then like 4 humans who are being imaged, and that's the input data to construct the dissimilarity matrices. And if the inference was that the kind of low-level physiology gives you access to the vehicles, then on the basis of the resemblance between those 2 matrices, you would want to conclude that the vehicles are going to be similar between monkey IT cortex and human IT cortex, which doesn't look terrifically. It doesn't look to me anyway to be terrifically plausible. They're just really wildly different anatomically, physiologically, and so on. So I mean, one question is, what is the epistemic gold standard for access to vehicles, and what kind of methods give us an insight into that? But second, if it is these low-level physiological things, then the single unit electrophysiology from the monkeys in the Kriegskort 2008 paper looks like it's tapping into vehicle information in the monkeys, but it's a very strange inference to say on the basis of the comparison between the dissimilarity matrices with humans that the vehicles would resemble each other. You wouldn't expect that. So I guess this is following up on Charles's question about how much weight we should put on the similarity between those 2 conditions there. So that's, I guess, two or more questions that I want to sort of open up there.
Great. So those are both great questions. I don't think that we actually know what the ground truth vehicles are. I don't think they're single cells, right? I think they're populations. Yeah. So we're sampling the ground truth vehicles when we do single cell recording, and we're sampling the ground truth vehicles when we're doing fMRI. And neither of those, I think, are, exactly what the ground truth is. Maybe that makes the Kriegskort paper a little bit less weird, because, in some sense, I think both of them are ways of sampling what the ground truth vehicle is, and they're ways of sampling that both probe the same kind of representational relationships. But I mean, for one thing, I wasn't sure whether you thought the weirdness was that we got it between monkey and human, or the weirdness was that we got it between single cell and large voxel signals. So I think I don't find it weird that monkey and human visual representations are very similar. I think, my assumption is that they were bound to be very similar, at least for these kinds of naturalistic visual stimuli. I mean, we're looking at a visual area, not a high level conceptual area. So
I think the weirdness is in trying to think about what this might imply about the vehicles of, say, the neural vehicles of human the neural vehicles of those representations in humans. So if the question is, if the point is you can use low-level information to make inferences about vehicles, then I'm not sure if I would really expect the neural vehicles to be the same in humans and in monkeys, even with the evolutionary conservation. I guess that's what I found a little weird, right? I guess it depends. Yeah, I mean, as you point out, we don't really know what the vehicles are in any of these cases, so maybe you shouldn't have any expectations about it. But
well, I mean, I do think that it's weird that, weird, but not weird in the sense of surprisingly successful that when you classify single neuron recordings according to like similarity of spike train, and then you classify voxels in terms of similarity of activation, you get, very similar structural geometries. And so I find that surprising, but I also think it's, it comes from the data, so it's surprising in a good way. I think hard for me to think to see how this could be pure artifact, and it suggests that the kinds of low-level coding that are essentially giving rise to the single cell data are occurring in populations that are widespread enough that you're getting high-level coding that parallels it. And the fact is it's IT, so it's really, the fact that it's monkey and human, I don't find that too weird. It's really, the surprising part is that you're getting similar classification on both the low, the very fine-grained and the very coarse-grained. And maybe if I thought about it more, I could make some inferences about what the vehicle would have to be in order to give you that kind of result. And also maybe you could infer something about what expectations you could have for other kinds of regions on that basis, but I haven't gone there. But I think those are great questions.
Charles, do you want to ping pong on this? I have some more stuff about the relationship between this and Shepherd, but if you want to pick this up now, we can.
Well, just unless you have a quick follow-up, I suggest to begin the Q&A with the attendees.
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's do, yeah, I've got another question, but let's do that, and we'll see how things develop.
I'll email you about this Shepherd stuff, Adina.
What's that?
I said I can email you later about the Shepherd stuff.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
Good. So there's lots of interest from the attendees. Let me begin with Matteo Grasso and then Mike Anderson has also booked the question. Welcome, Matteo.
Hi, can you hear me?
Clear.
And yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so first of all, thanks Adina for the great talk. I have a question about the notion of representations in general, and well, the question is the following. So, what are the representations in RSA representations of? And my question is basically based on this realization during your talk. I was thinking about these dissimilarity matrices, and I was noticing that, of course, sometimes we notice that faces look more like each other than they look like things that are very different from faces, right? So we could think that the representations that we can get basically from RSA are representations of objective features in the objects that are out there in the world. But what we know is that concept cells have been found to do crazy things. There's concept cells firing both for Luke Skywalker and Yoda. There's concept cells firing for basically all the actors in the cast of Friends. And if we train somebody on purpose, we could also probably train a single concept cell to fire for Master Yoda and to Raphael, because we expose both at the same time for different trials. So what I'm trying to say is that RSA would end up maybe, or the dissimilarity matrices would end up maybe saying that Raphael and Yoda are more similar than I don't know, two things that are objectively, so to speak, that seem more similar to each other. So what I'm trying to say here maybe goes under the rubric of internalism versus externalism in representations, right? And I'm trying to ask your opinion about whether representations are representations of similarity out there in the world or in experience, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So I think it's a great question, and I think that's where the second order comparisons in RSA are really important. So it's evidence for representation of the thing to which it's correlated. So in the case of IT, it really is, I think, largely correlated with feature similarity. But there are other parts of the brain where the correlation space is different. So there's part of the brain where facial identity is the thing that is picked out, or where you get the most invariance with respect to facial identity. There's another part where it's angle of view, and so your hypothesis about what the representations are representations of is bound to the model that you're using to compare it to. So is that clear?
Yeah, so basically you're saying if we consider IT, then we can find representations that map more onto the objective features of the objects. But if we go more downstream, if we go maybe towards, I don't know, hippocampus or other areas that we know have maybe concept sets that are more, so to speak, they make more abstract associations, then this will be a little bit more, it will depart a little bit, the representation will depart a little bit from the objective features of the objects, but they will sort of become more abstract. Is that roughly what you are suggesting?
Yeah, so one possibility is that there are multiple dimensions of representation encoded in the very same piece of cortex, and that you'll find high correlation with different structures because different parts, different populations of cells are going to respond to different kinds of features, and so you might get high correlations with multiple models.
I see.
Right, but they may not be so high because you're going to get noise from the other things that you're eliciting also. So, one question is, what kind of correlation to your model signal is going to be high enough for you to say that that's really something that's being represented? And I think that's a tough question. I'm not sure how to answer that. So, when you've got this pretty glaring similarity between the things in IT, I think you can feel pretty confident that that's being represented. But suppose you had a much noisier kind of similarity space, would you say that that's, sort of a chance thing, or you're kind of representing that, or is it just that there's so many other dimensions being encoded by the same voxels that you're, that's being represented, but there are also multiple other kinds of dimensions. So I think that's where it gets a lot harder to interpret.
I see.
Yeah, so I think that all of these kinds of judgments are kind of comparative judgments. How well does whatever kind of structure you're putting into your RSA correlate with the neural activity?
Sure, sure. And there is, as you show in one of the images, there is a role for the dissimilarity judgment of the person too. So if we wanted, not that we have to check for the correlation or the matching with whatever is the similarity or dissimilarity of features in the object, but we can also, well, consider what subject is saying and maybe use that piece to, well, yeah, as a piece of the explanation. Okay, I don't want to take more time. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Now, let me invite Mike Anderson, another great friend of neural mechanism since its early days. Welcome, Mike.
You ready?
Yeah. Hi, Mike.
Yeah, so that was a great talk, first of all. I look forward to reading the paper. In fact, that whole special issue of Synthèse looks amazing. So the question, or really I'm going to ask you a comment on this statement. So it looks like RSA shows that some high-level neural representations map neatly onto psychological representations, right? So categories, for instance. But it also looks like RSA, along with, say, evidence from deep neural nets, if you think that's good evidence, show low-level features do not map neatly onto intuitive psychological features.
Say that again. You sort of cut out.
Yeah, so that RSA, along with deep neural net, appear to show that low-level features of objects don't map neatly onto intuitive psychological features. That is, the neural representations of those features.
Yep.
So that looks to me like an indictment of structuralism, or something much more Gestalt. Is that how it looks to you, or what do you have any thoughts on that?
Can you tell me a little bit more what you're referring to?
Well, so you know, you showed in your presentation, you showed how, you know, the RSA in early visual cortex wasn't much structure there. And then if you look at with the way deep neural nets break down features, they're just really weird things that have no match in experience. Your convolutional neural nets. And people like Poldrack are suggesting that these deep neural nets tell us something real about brains. And so it looks like at the high level, these representations match nicely to our psychological categories. But at the low level, they have nothing to do with experience at all.
So I guess I don't take that away from the RSA stuff at all. So it seems like one of the things that's going on is at the low level, what we have is the spatial scale at which things are presented at the low level, like in V1, is much smaller than the voxels that we're looking at, and the kinds of feature maps that deep learning breaks things into, I guess I don't see a conflict there. So when you show a variety of low-level stimuli, there's a lot of variability, and so you're going to get stuff that looks homogeneous or just noisy in visual cortex, because it's not structured according to, so the input set isn't structured according to the representational structure of cortex. But yeah, I guess I don't think that we're getting information that low-level features don't map onto the structure of cortex. We're just getting that the things that we've been studying in these experiments when we're giving complex objects are not targeting the low-level features. So we're not seeing structure there, right? So I think that Kamitani and Tong paper that actually does look at low-level features shows that they are you are seeing structure in low-level cortex.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. That's fair. I have to think more about this. But
So if I can jump in on this really quickly, I mean, Mike, I'm not sure if this is to your point, but there is a long and mathematically formidable paper that Diedrichsen and Kriegskort did in 2017, where they compare encoding models, pattern component modeling, and RSA. And what you're talking about with the low-level feature stuff, encoding model frameworks are closer to, I think, the kind of model that you're talking about here. And the comparison there of how the same data can be analyzed with encoding models and with RSA might shed some light on this a little bit. I mean, I don't think they're necessarily opposed to each other in the way that you're suggesting here, but that might be someplace to look for some insight into this. And there are encoding models that do featural decomposition even for high-level cognition. So the semantic tiling paper that Barcelou responds to, for example, is one. So there are some attempts to apply those kinds of featural decompositional analyses in the same kind of analytic framework. So I mean, that might be somewhere to look for connections there.
Can I try to just reiterate Mike's point to see if I've understood it? Or
Yeah.
should we let somebody else jump in?
Please go on.
Yeah, I'm happy.
So maybe this is one sort of very abstract, well, maybe it's just a different way of putting it, but part of Adina's presentation involved the idea that at a high level, when we get MVPA data, we're getting a blurred representation of the real thing, which exists at a low level, which would be sort of crisp rather than blurry. And maybe it's just not like that. Maybe the semantic categories that we know from experience, and that's, I think, a phrase that Mike used in his question, those are sort of visible, or they only have a neural signature at a gross level of organization. And if we want to look for the real thing, those features of the world that are crisply represented or more exactly represented at a low level of spatial organization in the brain, you're going to have to do away with these high level semantic categories that are familiar from experience, and instead go for things that are more surprising to us, more abstract, more sort of theoretically refined, and not so sort of folk psychological. Is that related to what Mike was saying?
Well, Mike says yes. Yeah.
Is Mike there?
I mean, I guess.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If that were true, that would be some sort of threat to the generalizability of these methods.
I'll self here. I'm just starting to think these things through. I don't know if you, Adina, and the others have read Russ's contribution to that same special issue, but that started me thinking along these lines. And your talk also seemed to reinforce this notion that the categories of psychological experience and the categories of neural representation can come apart in various ways. And they come together, clearly in MT, they come together in a really nice way. But in other parts of cortex that we've studied, they don't seem to come together in quite the same way. And that's, I don't know about this yet, but that strikes me as an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, there are categories of psychological experience that are nicely represented in early visual areas, like, on-off boundaries and oriented lines and things like that. It's just that our experience tends not to be of those things. Those are things that contribute to our experience. And the other thing is that because of the way in which early visual cortex is organized, what you see is iterated patterns of these kinds of selectivities in such a way that there's not going to be high you know, at a coarse spatial scale, those things are going to wash out. So if you have over a millimeter of cortex, an array of different edge detectors that sort of cover the, you know, that tile the space, then any one or two comparisons of these edges is going to essentially wash out, other than the anisotropies that like Tong has found. But you know, the large amount of the signal is going to get washed out. But that doesn't mean that that the organization of the space is not understandable in some kind of way, right? It's just that the tools for probing that space, or the better tools for probing that space, are going to be targeting individual receptive field properties. Does that make sense? I mean, you know, it seems to me that the work thus far on deep learning nets, that you get quite similar types of weird receptive field properties in those, and when you do single cell recordings. At least that was what I've taken away from like DiCarlo's experiments.
Sorry, I have muted the mic because of the echo, but I will unmute him specifically when. Okay, Mike.
Sorry about the echo. That's right. But if you look at the representations of those receptive fields, they tend not to look like anything that we would intuitively use to break down an image.
Right.
Background here, I'm skeptical a little bit of the human-weasel stuff, about that's the right way to interpret what's going on there, but that's a side conversation. But if you look at the stuff from the deep neural nets, it's these weird feature gradients and texture gradients and things like this, and that's not at all how we break down our own experience of the image. I don't doubt that those are part of the causal mediators of our perception, but that's not how we would break down our perception into units.
Oh, I think I now understand. Now I understand your question. Yes. So I agree that our sort of intuitive conceptual machinery is way more tuned to high-level psychological features, because in fact that's what it's all aiming to generate, than the low-level stuff, right? We may not have a good way of characterizing a lot of the intermediate stuff, because that's not what our brains are aiming to ultimately compute, right? So in some ways, that I don't find it surprising that the high-level stuff matches the sort of intuitive things that we would plug into RSA. But I also think that if we had good ways of generating structural spaces for the intermediate stuff, we might be able to plug that in and find the structural, you know, fMRI analogs at these more intermediate levels. So this is actually getting at the cognitive ontology question, right? And yeah. I think, yeah, we have very poor access into the ontological building blocks of mental representation. I think we have much better access at the high level, where we can, you know, introspect and look at things that are behaviorally relevant, than at lower or intermediate levels, which aren't themselves behaviorally relevant. Does that seem? Is Mike there?
Yeah.
Yes, you've clearly honed into my obsessions here.
Yeah. Well, I'm still lamenting the fact that we did not meet last week on this obsession of both of ours.
Yeah.
Although yeah, rescheduled. So keep your eyes open.
Okay, I also regret that. But I've just noticed that we are almost run out of time. We just have 10 minutes. And I remember that both Charles and Dan had something to add. So Dan, you had a follow. Well, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
One man we will need 2 hours, but.
Yeah, right. This is on the suggestion that that if you're on board with the Shepard and Metzler 1971 study, then you should be on board with thinking of this as representations. Just a super small, I guess, picky historical note is that the actual Shepard and Metzler paper is vastly more cagey than any of the subsequent exegesis and interpretation. I don't think the term representation ever appears in there. And when they talk about kind of operations like mental rotation, it's always scare quoted. They are just amazingly cagey about this. Really, I mean, the paper itself just presents the data and the methods. It's, it's an incredibly exiguous and cautious presentation. But I think actually this is I mean, my own interpretation of their caginess there is in line with my own caginess about RSA. I think that what these discover are, I mean, I'm a little more cagey than even you about this. I mean, I think that what these discover are phenomena, right? Shepard and Metzler discovered a phenomenon that might be explained by a representational hypothesis of one kind or other. They themselves don't advance that, right? They just present the phenomena. I think that RSA gives us something very, very similar. It characterizes a phenomenon, namely a particular pattern in response profiles of a particular area. One way to account for that might be by a representational hypothesis about what's going on in there. I don't think that RSA itself, I personally don't think that it actually tells you that. I think that that's something that you then have to actually investigate the internal structure and the downstream connectivity of what goes on in the area and so on to unpack that. So at that level, I actually agree with you that Shepard and Metzler in the original text and RSA should be interpreted similarly. I just think that you should step back from even a representational interpretation. I think that this characterizes a relatively stable structure of phenomena, either in people's behavior or in the patterns going on in a particular region that should then, and then you can make representational hypotheses about it. I don't think that RSA itself delivers those. So I'm kind of on board with that. And in fact, the causal downstream, that when you actually look at the behavioral correlations with RSA and people's judgments, it gets, I mean, as you know, it gets just super messy. So the stuff on comparing the dissimilarity matrices between, human IT activity and overt similarity judgments, it's not actually a great overlap between the two. So if the idea that a particular region had content had to be validated by readout in behavior, it's actually pretty hard to find direct readouts from regions of cortex and behavior in that way. And that, I think, ought to make us very careful about, using that as the gold standard for kind of direct effects on downstream behavior as the gold standard for representational content in those areas. So I guess that's a pitch for an even more cautious interpretation of both Shepard and Metzler and RSA with respect to this stuff, as characterizing phenomena and not actually even a preliminary hypothesis about representation.
Sounds pretty useful. Thanks. Thanks for this historical remark and conceptual remark. And Charles, you want to add a final comment before the final response?
Actually, the question I had might take a while to unpack, and it was partially related to what Mike already said. So maybe we should just give Adina time to answer Dan's question.
Okay. Am I on? You hear me? Yeah, I think that was super helpful. So I agree. It certainly characterizes phenomena. It may just be a matter of temperament, as whether you want to think those phenomena give you license to infer the existence of representation, or whether you want to be really neutral about that. I think I mean, you could obviously give an account. If we knew everything about everything, we could give an account of behavior without making reference to representation. But I think that representation is a hugely useful way of thinking about things. And it seems to me that if you want to, so to the degree that you get similarity between the structure in one area and the structure of behavior, it's not surprising to me that you don't get one-to-one correspondence, because what you're not looking at an output that is directly from whatever part of the brain you're imaging in fMRI. But I think that if you're looking to make causal hypotheses, looking to direct, let's say, your next intervention for where to TMS something or where to stick your electrode in order to get evidence for causal efficacy, then I think that the results from RSA are hugely helpful. Whether you want to consider it evidence for representation or not, if you're going to be committed to representation and you get good results from the representational geometry, I think that gives you reason to infer the existence of representation of that sort there. So I think that, yeah, I don't think that the absence of correspondence to, with RSA is going to give you reason to
Oh, not now.
Oh man, bad timing. Yeah.
Looks like a Netflix.
There we go.
We missed 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think if you fail to get correspondence in RSA, you cannot rule out the possibility that there are representations there, because RSA is limited by its, resolution, both spatially and temporally. And if you do get correspondence with RSA, I think it gives you prima facie reason to look for evidence of representation there, but I don't think that it demonstrates that you've got it there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
this seems reasonable. I think there's a lot more to say about kind of what other sources of evidence would really be needed to kind of pin this down. I think, but that's a larger debate that we can hash out in email.
Well,
but yeah, no, I think that's temperamental differences are playing a role in this to some degree.
yeah.
So, but yeah, no, I think that seems reasonable. Yeah.